All right, everyone, we are going to get started. I'm sure more people will trickle in as we continue, but for now, I want to dive in so that we have enough time for everyone to talk about false solutions to our waste crisis. So thank you everyone who is here with us today. We are so thrilled to have you. My name is Olivia Sinaraki, and I am the communications director for Just Zero. Just Zero works to implement just and equitable zero waste solutions across the country. Yet every day we are up against false solutions to our waste crisis pushed by the plastics, fossil fuel, and chemical industries. And that's why we're here today, to talk about how we leave those false solutions behind. Now, before we dive in, I do want to introduce our guests. With us today, we have Kevin Boudris from Just Zero, Veena Singla from NRDC, and Jessica Roth from Gaia. Thank you all for being here. We are so thrilled to have you and can't wait to hear your input as we dive into this topic. Now, just a few housekeeping notes. A reminder to everyone that this event is being recorded. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please add those in the Q&A section of Zoom, and we will try and answer as many of those as we can towards the end of the event. With that said, I want to dive into our first topic of conversation. Burning waste leaves a toxic legacy. Now, we all know greenwashing and corporate agendas are everywhere. We see this especially in attempts to brand trash incineration as waste to energy or dangerous high heat plastics disposal as advanced recycling. So my first question right off the bat is, what happens when waste or plastic is burned? Jessica, if you could dive in, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to start out by just backing up a little bit to explain, that most of you may already know this, or maybe you don't yet, but industry, which is the plastics, fossil fuel, chemical industry, because they're really all the same beast if we're pulling back the curtain, are all talking about this chemical recycling, advanced recycling, molecular recycling. I put quotes around all of them because none of them are actually recycling. And they're claiming that what they're going to do is take all of these different kinds of plastics that we've not been able to deal with for the past 50 years in our waste streams, whether we're talking about ones that have different rigidity or different colors or different formats, and put them all together and magically create a beautiful new plastic that's going to rival virgin plastics and is going to have the safety requirements for being food contact materials. Now, none of this is actually true. This is not what they're doing, but it is what they say that they're doing. They also claim they're going to do this with almost no greenhouse gas emissions, no toxic emissions, no toxic waste to deal with at the end. And in fact, what they're doing is creating systems with that use very high heat for incineration. They're claiming it's not incineration or combustion because they say that there's no oxygen involved, but there's no way to get rid of all of the oxygen. So there in fact is incineration happening, and that is going to create the monomer or breakdown to the monomers and polymers that are used to create other plastics. But in fact, what's mostly happening is they're creating pyrolysis oil, or pie oil, they've started calling it now as well, which is a fuel, and which industry is arguing is actually another building block. And so they're saying that this is how they are being circular, and they're not just creating waste to energy. And of course, in this process, they are expending immense amounts of energy to create the high heat conditions. So that's highly intensive, which also means resources like water and money and the actual energy to create these systems. And then they're also emitting loads of greenhouse gases and toxic emissions. For starters, greenhouse gases, the industry keeps talking about greenhouse gases sort of writ large, but when they actually get down to it, they're actually just talking about carbon. So they're also ignoring all of the other greenhouse gases, one of the main ones of which would be methane, because we're dealing with natural gas products. And then on top of that, there's all of the toxins that are inherent in the petroleum and fossil fuel products, as well as the ones that industry is adding for color, for texture, for rigidity, all of those things. And those all get emitted out as they're burning these products. And then at the end, there's also waste products that are still as contaminated with all of these other byproducts that have to be addressed, which also industry is pretending don't exist at the end. And of course, all of that has massive impacts for the environment, for climate, for communities, and mostly, most of the communities where these facilities are built are already overburdened by all kinds of other infrastructure that we have in this country, and are predominantly Black and brown and low socioeconomic groups.
Kevin, it looks like you came off mute. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I'd like to just build on what Jessica said, especially when it comes to the toxic emissions and kind of what we're being lied to about when it comes to these processes, to kind of put out the really basic, simple truth of toxics in, toxics out. So whether we're talking advanced recycling, or whether we're talking about mass burn incineration, or so-called waste to energy, or gasification of sewage sludge, or anything else, when you've got material laden with toxics and you burn that material, you're going to get toxics back on the back end. There's no way around that. And our waste, our plastic, our sewage sludge, all of the things that we're always trying to get rid of is full of toxic chemicals. Things like heavy metals, carcinogens, and on and on and on. And if you burn that waste, or you use heat or solvents to break that waste down, you end up with those toxic emissions. You end up with toxic waste byproducts, toxics in wastewater, and everything else, again, that's coming out the back end. And the same is true for those greenhouse emissions, those climate damaging emissions that Jessica mentioned. Same principle, carbon in, carbon out. Plastic is a fossil fuel product. Our waste is full of plastic and other carbon storing materials. When you burn it, when you heat it, you're going to get carbon dioxide, you're going to get carbon monoxide, you're going to get methane. There's no way around it. And of course, the waste industry, the fossil fuel industry, anybody looking to make a buck off fossil fuels or waste, they're happy to greenwash, to outright lie, to make it seem like their technology is safe or climate friendly or environmentally friendly. And these were the lies that they told in the 1980s when they tried to rebrand incineration as trash to energy, to make it seem like it was clean, to make it seem like it would generate renewable energy. And these facilities for the last 40 years have left a legacy of asthma, heart disease, cancers, and nearby communities. And this is the pattern we see out playing again and again when it comes to advanced recycling, when it comes to attempts to use gasification on sewage sludge, and so on and so forth. You just can't get around it. Carbon in, carbon out, toxics in, toxics out. It's just that simple.
Thanks, Kevin. I think that is really, really important to mention. Now, we obviously know that any type of waste burning, plastics burning is toxic, climate damaging, but where are these facilities located? Kevin, do you want to give us some insight into that?
Yeah, Jessica already hit on this. They are predominantly located in communities of color and low-income communities. The waste industry, the fossil fuel industry, every other polluting industry has a long and well-documented history of forcing these facilities into environmental justice communities, into the communities already overburdened by pollution, and the communities that are least able to afford to fight back. It's certainly true of the biggest, most polluting trash incinerators. States like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland that rely on waste incineration truck waste from whiter, wealthier communities into communities of color and burn it. And that's not an accident, it's intentional. These communities have long been viewed as sacrifice zones, and that's how these companies and the state governments that abet these injustices treat them. And it's a pattern we see in other industries, in the petrochemical industry, where their facilities are predominantly located in communities of color in Louisiana and on the Gulf Coast in Texas. And again, we see it with these new types of facilities that are being pushed. These industries view environmental justice communities as sacrifice zones, and they are more than happy to force these facilities on these communities.
Thanks, Kevin. Veena or Jessica, do you either have anything you would like to add to that?
Yes, I will just say that, as we've heard, these waste incinerators, advanced recycling, petrochemical facilities are releasing a variety of these health-harming pollutants. And the people most impacted are those who live near these facilities, but they're not the only ones, because these processes and these facilities also release chemicals that are some of the kind that's known as persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And what does that mean? That means they don't break down in the environment. They build up in people's bodies and in wildlife, and they're harmful. And they can travel long distances far away from these facilities where they're produced. So communities, wildlife people, many thousands of miles away can be affected by these chemicals and pollution released by these facilities.
And I just want to add to that too, that, you know, as we were saying, like, these are the same communities that most of this dirty infrastructure from kind of all parts of our existence are located. So, you know, to Vina's point about bioaccumulation and the highly toxic emissions, these are communities that have already been affected by those kinds of things prior from other existing infrastructure. So like we all saw during COVID, right? The people that were dying the most were the people that had these comorbidities. And that's not coincidental, right? Like those are the same communities who get literally all of our garbage dumped on them. And so they are taking in all of these toxins. And, you know, people sometimes think if it's just emissions that it's all going to be like respiratory issues, but no, like we're talking about neurological and endocrine and reproductive, like all of these systems of people are affected by these terrible toxins that are coming out. And when they're coming from all different sides, the body just can't handle all of that, right? And shouldn't have to handle all of that. So it's a really a problem in that it's systemically repetitive on purpose because of how capitalism values and doesn't value certain lives.
Those are some really, really great points. Thank you, Jessica. Something I just want to touch on real quickly is that, you know, this isn't just a waste disposal problem, right? It's happening from the start of plastic production when, you know, you're going into the ground to get that oil and gas. So Kevin, could you just dive into that, the full life cycle of this toxic problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Olivia. So, you know, it's important to kind of, especially when we're talking about advanced recycling and plastics, to bring it back to what plastics are. They are predominantly a fossil fuel product. 99+% of all the plastics made in the US are sourced from fossil fuels. And they are a petrochemical product. They are manufactured using energy-intensive facilities that combine fossil fuels with other toxics to make plastic resins, which then have more toxics added to them to give them the right color or the right level of flexibility or so on and so forth. And then we're taking these toxic plastic fossil fuel products and wrapping them around our food and wrapping them around our day-to-day products and our healthcare products. And so at each stage of that journey, there are immense impacts on our climate, on public health, on our day-to-day lives, and on communities, from extracting those fossil fuels to those energy-intensive facilities that are manufacturing these, to the fact that many of these plastics are leaching toxics into our food and the other products in our lives. There's really no way to escape that cycle when we have these toxic fossil fuel-based products in our lives.
Yeah, that's so true, Kevin. Vina, if you wouldn't mind, how does this relate to advanced recycling? Can you make that connection for us?
Yes, thank you. And I would build off what Kevin was saying, is that the types of pollution and concerns that he discussed are also a concern for this so-called advanced recycling, from the process itself and the pollution generated to the product and what is in that product. And if it was actually recycling any plastic, what kind of contaminants would be in that plastic and leach from it and affect people who could be using those products. And I think it's just a reminder that plastics are toxic from the beginning to the end. And the horrible train derailment in Ohio, I think, is a reminder of that, where that vinyl chloride used to make the polyvinyl chloride plastic, which is a carcinogen itself, that vinyl chloride, and then the burning of that material leading to concerns about additional cancer-causing chemicals called dioxins that are of the type I was mentioning earlier, right? These persistent bioaccumulative toxic that can build up and people can travel far and wide. And we know that the facilities that make the vinyl chloride itself release hundreds of thousands of pounds of vinyl chloride pollution into the air every year, and are also generating millions of pounds of hazardous waste. There's a great report from Toxic Free Future about this, the life cycle impacts that came out earlier. And, you know, I think some people are aware of PVC as the poison plastic, but in reality, these life cycle pollution impacts are not limited to PVC. So the kind of plastic used to make like plastic drinking water bottles, PET, also has a very toxic chemical footprint over its life cycle. A report from Defend Our Health came out that really traced the impacts over the full life cycle and just really laid out how it's unsafe, unjust, and unsustainable. So it's not just PVC. These are problems with all types of plastic across their life cycle.
Can I just jump in to add real quick that
Sure.
I was a lawyer in my past life, so I'm very particular about words. But I've taken to really like shying away from ever talking about like the plastic pollution or the plastic waste problem, right? That's not the problem. Plastic is the problem. It's sort of a bait and switch that government pushed by industry is telling us to focus on. And whenever there's like all of these policies that we're being asked to comment on, all these, they're all guidelines. They never have like regulatory bite. They don't have accountability and enforcement measures, and they all focus on plastic waste or plastic garbage or plastic pollution. But the problem is from the second that somebody tries to get the oil or gas out of the ground until the end, and it's a plastic problem writ large. And so I think like we need to change that narrative out in the world more so that everyone is talking about that, because yes, like we all know that plastic gives us lots of things that we need, right? Like it is a helpful material. We all know that. And also it's toxic and we're doing it wrong, and we need to have better systems to address it, and we need to be cutting down at the source on all of these terrible things that we don't actually need, but we are just made to think we need by the industry.
That is such a great point, Jessica. I'm so happy you mentioned that, because wording and the narrative is everything. I do think this is a great transition into our next topic of conversation, which is a deeper dive into so-called advanced recycling. Now, before we dive in, though, we do have a poll for you all. So that poll you should be seeing on your screens momentarily. Please fill that out, and we will get back to the results in a little bit. While you're filling that out, I do want to dive into that definition, which I know we've mentioned already, but just as a refresher for everyone, what is so-called advanced recycling? Vina, can you start us off on this?
Yes, and I will say that industry has made this intentionally confusing, and there's sort of two levels of confusion. So the first is that there's many different terms that are being used to encompass the same toxic technologies. So you might hear advanced recycling, chemical recycling, molecular recycling, plastics renewal. I think that's my favorite one right there. And they sound different, they sound technical, but they're all referring to the same things. So I'd say that's one level of confusion is all these different terms, and many of them include the word recycling in the term, which any common sense person would think it means recycling, when in fact, the majority of what's happening at these chemical recycling facilities in the US is actually turning plastics into fuel, which is not recycling at all. So that's the first level of confusion. Then the second level is that these terms refer to a whole set of different processes and technologies. So it's not just one thing. So there's these different processes, like we've heard some of them mentioned already: pyrolysis, gasification, solvolysis, methanolysis, glycolysis, and solvent purification. Again, all these kind of technical sounding terms. And what they have in common is that they can be used to turn plastic into chemicals, or in theory, into plastic. But again, the majority of what we're seeing is really the plastic to fuel. So not this theoretical plastic to plastic, but really the plastic to fuel. And these processes, while they might have their technical differences in terms of how they work, are they using high heat? Are they using chemicals? Are they using some combination? They all have a set of things in common. So first, they lack transparency. The chemical recycling companies, the plastics fossil fuel industry, does not want to be transparent about what's actually happening in these processes, the emissions, the hazardous waste generation, any of these questions that communities have when the facilities are proposed to be sited near them. All of these processes generate harmful air pollution, whether you're talking about particulate matter or hazardous air pollutants, like cancer-causing chemicals like benzene. And then all of these processes do one or more of these things. They might use hazardous chemicals, they might produce hazardous chemicals, they might generate hazardous waste. So all of the chemical recycling processes do at least one of those things, and some of them do all three. And then finally, none of these processes are actually operating at any sort of scale or reliability. So that's something else that they all have in common, where they're sort of billed as this magical solution, but in reality, it's not clear that they could even work.
Thanks, Veena. I think that was a very clear picture of just how toxic this technology is. So we're going to give you our results to the poll. And while those come up, I do want to go to my next question. If this is so toxic, why is it such a hot topic in state houses and in advertising and everywhere right now? Kevin, could you provide some insight on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And the answer is frankly because the fossil fuel industry is putting billions of dollars behind a push to promote advanced recycling. The industry knows it's toxic. They know everything that Veena just said, that it doesn't really work. And yet they're using advanced recycling as another greenwashing opportunity. But they're not just happy to sit back and rhetorically promote advanced recycling. They want so-called success stories for advanced recycling. They want to be able to point to operating facilities so that they can claim that advanced recycling is doing something other than what it actually is. So they can use it as this greenwashing opportunity to make plastics look sustainable. And so to that end, they're engaged in a massive campaign at both the federal and state levels to push laws and exemptions from regulations that make it easier to build and operate advanced recycling facilities. They have tried and thankfully failed to push the federal government to exempt advanced recycling facilities from certain protections under the Clean Air Act. They are currently trying to push the federal government to exempt plastic waste from certain protections under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act under federal law. And they're engaged in a huge campaign in state houses all across the country to push legislators and lawmakers to reclassify advanced recycling facilities from waste or recycling facilities to manufacturing facilities. And they've convinced at this point 24 states across the country to pass these types of reclassification laws, or manufacturing loophole laws, as we call them at Just Zero. And it may not seem like that big a deal, the distinction between a waste facility, a recycling facility, or a manufacturing facility, but it is a big deal. Almost every state across the country requires waste facilities to undergo public permitting processes. They impose siting restrictions on these facilities. They impose certain reporting and inspection requirements. They impose operating conditions. And they also require waste facilities to maintain closure plans and emergency plans. No state anywhere in the US requires the same level of community input or protections or reporting of manufacturing facilities. They just don't. And so the industry is pushing these manufacturing loophole laws precisely because they allow them to skirt common sense environmental protections. They allow them to make it easier to build these facilities all across the country, especially in the communities least able to afford to push back. And it does much more than just make it easier to build these facilities, these types of laws, these manufacturing loophole laws. You know, when you get rid of public permitting processes, it cuts communities out of the loop, out of the decision-making process. When you eliminate reporting and inspection requirements, it allows the industry to do what Vina was alluding to before, and avoid transparency, to hide the truth about what's happening at these facilities. And when you eliminate closure plan requirements, it allows the industry to just walk away from failed facilities. And many of these facilities have failed. And when you don't have to put up financial obligations or have a closure plan, you just walk away from a toxic site. And that's a big, big problem when we look at the legacy of these facilities. And so once again, you have an industry pulling the same type of greenwashing, making the same type of lies, and pushing for the same type of loophole laws that they did 40 years ago with incinerators, branding them as so-called waste to energy. And so what we're faced with now is this next 40 years of a toxic legacy of these dangerous facilities.
And I just also provide, also just to back up a little bit, right? One of the main reasons that industry is so invested in this and is spending so much money on these regulatory changes and on convincing us that this is the next best thing since sliced bread is because we're shifting away from fossil fuels, right? We're not doing it fast enough by any stretch of the imagination, right? We still need massive overhaul of all of our systems. But the fact of the matter is like electric vehicles are gaining speed, heat pumps are gaining speed. Like we're shifting. There's mandatory shifts off of natural gas in a lot of different places and buildings and things like that. And so industry knows that like the goose that lays the golden egg is they only have so much time to do this. And so they are putting everything into convincing us that plastic is important and we need it. And they completely won from the COVID pandemic, right? They were getting lots of bad press and people were getting really angry at industry. And then all of a sudden, like we all felt this panic and needed single-use plastic. And so they kind of regained their standing. And now they're using what they're viewing as goodwill also to move forward these ideas and convince us that they have all these brilliant plans when they know that that's not obviously what's happening, but the plan is to get as much money. I mean, this is cynical, but really, like they want as much money as possible, as soon as possible. And then like whatever happens afterwards, fine, we don't care. And so there's public money, there's private money. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if half of them don't care if these facilities ever work at all. It's just a question of getting tax breaks and other incentives and private and public money invested. I mean, I think they're bordering on fraud, possibly actually at fraud. There's definitely false advertising. Like they're breaking all kinds of laws to do this. But the plan is just put it all out there as quick as possible and get as much as we can get in. And it's another reason why they're doing things like segmenting what they're working on. They're really proud of this new like approach of modularity, where for example, in Point Township in Pennsylvania, Encina has a proposal for a plastic sorting and storage facility. That's not the plan. The plan is for a chemical recycling facility. But the first thing is easy, and they only need specific like permit citing for the building. It's much less restrictive. They don't have to worry about all these things. And then, you know, it's like the proverbial like camel's nose under the tent, right? As soon as they get there, then they're going to bring in these other pieces. And I was at a chemical recycling conference that was hosted by the American Chemistry Council, which was a whole that's like, I feel like that's like a 3-day workshop I could give on that, but they know they're lying, right? Like they're conscious of this, and they were talking about like all these great advancements, and one of them is the modularity and like being able to put out these pieces separately and both be able to like come in and out quickly with that, as well as to like skirt regulatory provisions as they're doing it. So there's all of these different things happening, and they know that they're not creating what, like they even know they're not creating what they say they're creating, right? Like they know that they have a feedstock issue. They talked about it a million times, and it was always like a little pass off, and then they just went on to the next thing about how awesome they were. But in fact, they were saying that if they don't put uniform plastic, you know, homogeneous plastic into their machines, that they don't get that out, right? Like it doesn't just, and then they're astounded, you know, to Kevin's point about all the like greenwashing, then they're standing up, they're literally saying things like, you know, people seem to believe that we're just going to put any kind of plastic into these machines and magically get out this end product. That's completely inaccurate. I'm like, it has nothing to do with the hundreds of millions of dollars you spent to convince people of that. Of course it does. So they're playing all sides of the coin at every moment, where they can like claim ignorance or say this is better than it is. And like, because to Vina's point, right, there's no transparency about anything. And the more regulations that they're able to get themselves exempted from, the fewer transparency opportunities we have.
Thanks, Jessica. I think those are some really good points, and that conference sounds like it was very interesting. I think this is a great segue into our next poll. So you should be seeing that on your screens momentarily. And yeah, we're just curious to know if this technology could truly be used to actually recycle plastic, would you support it? So fill that out. And then as you do, I would love, Vina, if you could just tell us a little bit more. Obviously, as we've heard, you know, industry is trying to make advanced recycling make it as though plastics seem more sustainable, when in fact it just makes them more dangerous. So could you just kind of give us a little more details on that?
Yes, and I'll just say to comment on the results of the first poll, that we have a very smart audience. Most people correctly identified that advanced recycling is not really recycling any plastic. In the US, the answer was less than 1%. So to that point, right, these facilities are not really recycling any large amount of plastic, either because they're explicitly making fuel, right, which is not recycling, or because they're just so small scale, their process doesn't work, they're not really recycling much. But let me tell you what they are doing. I'm going to give you 3 specific examples. Braven in North Carolina, it's located in a disproportionately Black community. They're a large quantity hazardous waste generator. They generated 19,000 pounds of hazardous waste in 2021. Altera, located in Ohio, a disproportionately Black and low-income community, generated 63,000 pounds of hazardous waste in 2021. Agilix in Oregon generated more than 400,000 pounds of hazardous waste in 2021. So does this sound like a sustainable solution to you? It certainly doesn't to me. They're generating hazardous air pollution and hazardous waste in marginalized communities and not really recycling a whole lot of plastic. This is not the solution that we need.
Thanks, Vina. I think that just tells you a lot right there, hearing about each of those individual facilities and just how much hazardous waste they are generating. So we've heard about just how bad advanced recycling is. So what are the real solutions? Kevin, could you start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. The real solution, especially when it comes to plastic, is to just stop making so much plastic. Reduce as much as possible the unnecessary single-use plastics in our lives. Like Jessica said earlier, plastic pollution it's not a waste problem, it's a plastic problem. We've talked about how toxic plastics are and how toxic advanced recycling or any form of burning plastic really is. We want to avoid this problem. If we want to address the problem itself, the answer is to stop making so much plastics. Same thing when it comes to waste. Like, we are in the midst of a waste crisis, and we have all of these industries pitching solutions like gasification and other forms of incineration to our waste problem. But the real solution is to reduce and divert waste as much as possible. And that's especially true for plastics. Now, we've talked a lot about the toxic impacts, the climate damaging impacts of plastics today. But we also need to touch on the fact that plastics just weren't designed to be recyclable. They are not a recyclable product by any stretch of the imagination at a wide scale. When we think of mechanical recycling, which is what we traditionally think of as recycling, mechanical recycling for plastics has been a failure. Fewer than 6% of all plastics, of all waste plastics in the country are recycled every year. And we've talked a lot today about how advanced recycling is a false solution. It's not going to work. It's not the answer here. The answer is to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work of pushing for changes, pushing for laws that reduce plastic pollution before it starts, that cut down on plastics production. We don't need silver bullets. We don't need magic acts or disappearing acts. We just need to get rid of the thing that's the problem itself, and that's plastic production. Now, we hear a lot from the industry about the revolutions that plastics have afforded us when it comes to medical care or making cars lighter and so on and so forth. But really what we're talking about is all the plastic junk that none of us ever asked for and none of us ever wanted. Look what fills your recycling bin and your trash bin. It's a lot of plastic packaging. Let's start there and turn off the tap and stop plastic pollution before it starts.
Yeah, I'll also say that while we're working to completely stop our plastic production, right, we need to take all the toxics out of the production, and that needs to be mandated as well, because a lot of the stuff that's added is really just so that you can have a green 7-Up bottle. Like, who cares, right? We only care about that now because they've told us to care about it. They've made it brand marketable that way, but there's no reason that some of our takeout containers are white and some are black and some are clear. Like, there's no reason for that. And that is part of the issue around where there's contamination of both recycling stream and externally, like in the environment and community and climate. And so that's like a quick first step, ostensibly. And then to move towards, as we're moving towards getting rid of all of this plastic production, we also have to be investing money in communities and community-based solutions like the reuse, refill, and all of those kinds of putting together stations and changing the way that we wrap and market things and making it so that there are ways to bring things back, centralizing that kind of those kinds of systems in smaller regions, right? Like, that's another big part of our problem is that we think we deserve to have something that is only grown in Guyana, and we live in Montreal, and it should be there whenever we want it. Like, that's not. The fact is that the reason people are catching on and deciding that thinking that chemical recycling is great is because it's an easy fix that you don't have to do anything about, right? It's a quick, easy tech fix. We don't have to change anything. We swap one in, we swap one out, and we're done. But the fact of the matter is we actually do have to reevaluate how the systems are working and what it is that we do. And if and when we are able to switch to those systems, we create healthier communities and healthier jobs and a healthier economy that's more stable and more regional and all of these other things. So it has tons of like co-benefits with it if we actually start to look critically at how the systems are working to keep us in this terrible rat race and to pull it out into a way that's actually supportive of community, culture, and jobs and healthiness.
All great points, Jessica. Now, before we transition to our Q&A, I do just want to put up the poll results from the second poll. And yeah, as expected, a lot of no ways and a lot of it depends on how safe and reliable and effective the technology becomes. Any closing thoughts from any of our speakers before we transition to the Q&A then? Dina, I saw you go off.
Yes, thank you, Olivia. That's that poll I think is a really great tie-in to what I wanted to say, because there was a lot of folks saying that like, hey, if it was safe and effective and reliable, like that's something I would think about. And we really think about the need to create non-toxic materials cycles, right? This is what Jessica was speaking to, better systems, safer systems. So part of a non-toxic material cycle means a recycling process that doesn't use or generate hazardous chemicals. The material inputs don't contain hazardous chemicals. They're safe and sustainable by design. The material outputs do not contain hazardous chemicals or contaminants, and the process doesn't generate hazardous waste. So this chemical recycling or advanced recycling as it currently exists does not meet any of these criteria. But if it did, I would say, yeah, maybe that could be a good process, but it would not be with fossil fuel-based plastics, as it would have to be a different material and it would have to be a different process. So I'll just say it's not necessarily the technology that's the problem, it's what's going in and what's coming out. And fossil fuel-based plastics are the problem in terms of all of the hazardous chemicals and pollution. So so we really do need to start with the worst first in terms of phasing out these problematic plastics and materials, as Jessica and Kevin were saying, our PVC, polystyrene, just unnecessary single-use items like cutlery. How many times have you picked up food and had a bunch of plastic stuff in there that you didn't want? It's completely unnecessary. So, to the question, and this is probably going into the Q&A about, medical devices, that's not the place to start necessarily, right? With what to eliminate. It's these other problematic and unnecessary materials, and then we can turn to some of these harder questions. And if the only use of plastic left was like my contacts and some medical devices, fine. we would have a teeny tiny problem, nothing like today.
Thanks, Fina. And that transitions very nicely into our Q&A. So the first question is, how much plastic is being sent to advanced recycling facilities? And Kevin, do you want to take this one?
It's a great question. And honestly, Vina may have more insight into this, but not much, if any, especially when we're talking about post-consumer plastic, which is often what we think about when we think about plastic waste. We think about the stuff that we put in our recycling bins in our home. And as was mentioned earlier, these advanced recycling facilities aren't set up by their own admission. They are not set up to handle that type of plastic waste because it's mixed plastic. And for these pyrolysis systems to work, they need a homogeneous feedstock coming in. They need a certain type of plastic and only that type of plastic coming in. And you can't get that from recycling bins. So virtually none of the waste plastic that we think of in our lives is going to these facilities. If they're operating using any type of plastic feedstock, it's the stuff that they're getting directly from industry, directly from warehouses and waste plastic from plastic manufacturing plants, et cetera.
Thanks, Kevin. Vina, considering Kevin said you might have more of a response to this, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I'll just say there's, like Kevin noted, there's just a lack of transparency of about these questions. So the real answer is we don't really know, but what I could gather from some of the press releases and promotional material that some of these companies put out, sort of touting like, here's how much material we've recycled or taken in or whatever. So an example is Agilix, which claims that it accepted like 1 million to 1.5 million pounds of polystyrene material over about a year, which sounds like a lot. Actually, it's like, oh wow, that's a lot of plastic. But then when you compare it to how much polystyrene its partner company actually produces, they're partnered with American Styrenics, located on the Gulf Coast. They're producing over 2 billion pounds of the material. So 1 million is like it's like nothing. It's a drop in the bucket.
Thanks, Vina. All right, so moving on to our second question. Plastics seem like such an integral part of modern life. Won't it take a long time to reduce single-use plastics? And shouldn't we pursue alternative solutions in the meantime? Jessica, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I would say it's a yes, and as most things are. It is going to take time. It is going to take effort, but we need to be pushing within our communities and pushing our elected officials and folks who have access to resources to make the decisions to invest in the correct things moving forward. And we need to be stopping and slowing down production in the interim so that we can kind of catch up with ourselves. We're not really going to catch up with ourselves, right? Because we have 50 years of plastic we still have to deal with. But the problem is that single-use systems are problematic in and of themselves, whether it's plastic or not. We cannot deal with that much waste and all of the things that, all these green companies are touting, these like, biodegradable plastic cups. They're not. I mean, all of our allied organizations are constantly doing studies on this, Five Gyres and others, and Greenpeace. Like, it may say that it's biodegradable and it may biodegrade, but like in 10 years or 15 years, like that's not the same thing as like throwing it in your backyard compost heap, like your coffee grinds, right? Like it's not that kind of biodegradable. And there's a lot of conversation. In fact, the Federal Trade Commission right now has out comments, but again, for guidelines, because usually we're not asking about actual, laws with teeth, but about whether they should do a rulemaking actually around labeling on these things, because there's also just vast quantities of lies in the advertising, right? Like these things are. People say that they do things, companies say that what their product is biodegradable, is compostable or whatever, but they're really not. And we just need to stop producing and using and throwing away so many things, no matter what their form is. So it's a multifaceted thing that we need to be addressing. And then obviously on top of that is all of the dangers and toxics and plastics that we need to just get out of our systems, because they're killing us, right? Like even those of us that are not living right next to a facility, like, do you think that there's no impact of the fact that all of our food has come packaged in plastic in the last 30 years? Like, no, that's real. Like those are real things that are happening to our bodies. So it is complicated. It is multifaceted. But as I said before, building the systems that are needed to replace these things actually move us forward in not just getting rid of single-use plastics, but in loads of other ways of being more climate friendly, being more community friendly, of creating better and more sustainable jobs that are safer and healthier, and all of these other things, keeping money in communities, regionalizing things, smaller, small business is better for everybody, and then moving those systems out. And honestly, this is my last note. I realized I was thinking about this like last weekend. I was upstate. We've been doing this with propane for like our whole lives, right? You buy a propane container for a gas tank or a stove or whatever it is, and you use the propane and you return the propane tank. Doesn't matter where. You can return to any place that sells a propane, and they'll give you another one with propane in it. we have these systems in operations, right? They're already working and we know they are. We just have to expand them and like build out into more systems that way.
I could just briefly add on to that, Olivia. I completely agree and would say that it's like, yes, and while we're working on source reduction, we also want to be investing in the systems that we need, right? We're building out the systems of tomorrow today, and we have a choice, right? There's a limited amount of public and private money. Where are we investing that? Chemical recycling infrastructure does not exist. So should we be investing in building that out, or should we be investing in building out reuse and refill systems? I would say very much the reuse and refill systems that are going to, again, like as Jessica said, safer, healthier, etc. It's this question of where do we want to go, right? Like where do we see ourselves going in the future? And advanced recycling takes us down one path, and reuse and refill systems take us down another path. So we have to think very carefully about where we want to focus and invest our money.
Thanks so much, Vina. Oh, Kevin. Real quick, Kevin.
Yeah, if I can just pile on this one as well. I mean, the fossil fuel industry, the waste industries, everyone who's promoting single use, they spend a lot of money trying to convince us that it is convenient for us, when in reality, it is convenient for those that are making money off of it. It's convenient for the fossil fuel industries and inconvenient for the rest of us, especially when you consider, like Jessica mentioned, that these reuse systems, that the zero waste systems actually invest in our communities and create jobs and make our lives better in a meaningful way, instead of taking our money and putting it in the pocket of the fossil fuel industries that are benefiting from all of these lies and all of this greenwashing.
Thanks, Kevin. I think we have time for just one more quick question. What can people on this webinar do to get involved? So I don't know who wants to start. Vina, do you have any tips, suggestions for our audience members and how they can get involved?
Yes, so I would say a couple things. One, we heard about the aggressive industry effort to relax common sense regulations on chemical recycling at the state and federal levels. So definitely contact your elected representatives about those efforts and weigh in to say that these facilities should be regulated just like everyone else that handles solid waste. They should not be exempted. And at the local level, you can get involved in your city's waste management, zero waste plans, plastic strategies. Cities are really stepping up in many places to try and reduce single-use plastics, by the city, by retailers. So supporting policies at the local and state level is a great way that people can get involved.
Thanks. Kevin and Jessica, do you have any other suggestions for our audience members on how they can get involved?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely agree with everything that Vina said. And so much of the change away from single-use plastics and reuse does happen at the local level. I mean, time and time again, we see in states that ban plastic bags that it starts with small towns and cities taking steps on that front. Same thing with polystyrene. I mean, so many of the towns and cities in this country are really those laboratories of change, coming up with the right zero waste systems that then we broadly implement. So absolutely get involved at the local level. And, frankly, it's awesome that all of you are here today learning. Do more of that. I mean, there are a lot of organizations working on all of this stuff. There have been a number of resources and reports put into the chat during this session. Stay plugged in, stay up to date, because we all know that the fossil fuel industry is going to continue to adapt and push their BS greenwashing, frankly. And the more we all do to stay plugged in, the better off we'll be.
I'll also add to that to keep an eye on, I mean, I agree, like pressure to your local and city, state, municipal, federal, all of them, all those electeds need to hear from us. As well as I see in the chat, you know, large corporations, all of that. I mean, corporations, they care about people because people spend their money with them. They don't really care about people, right? But so if you put your dollars where your mouth is but I would say also look and see what's happening in your communities already, because many communities already have organizations that are fighting for or against specific things to benefit the community, and keep an eye out for incoming proposals for things. These are the kind, you know, municipal solid waste is not sexy. Like people don't, it's not like on the news, right? You don't, not the same way. You don't get like fun flyers in your mail about it or whatever, which is another terrible thing, obviously. But keep an eye out about like new projects, and as well as if you have existing infrastructure in your community that might be being looked to be retooled and re-upped in different ways, because these are the kinds of things that happen all the time. And another thing I will say, which is not a very popular opinion, but is real, get involved in like the local boards and things in your community, whether you're talking about the school board, the tax boards, like those are the places where money moves and nobody knows about it. And that is how Alec in the Koch brothers have like taken over so much power in this country, is sneaking people onto school boards and zoning boards and tax boards. And then all of a sudden a big proposal comes forward and the zoning board goes, yep, you're clear sailing, because they're all planted people. So this is the place where all the controls that are like behind the scenes that nobody knows about happens. And oftentimes they don't require an enormous investment of your time and energy. It's not like running for your local like legislature, right? Which is like a full-time job, even though it's not paid that way. These are smaller scale engagements, but I think it's really important to keep an eye out. And if you're not able to do it, like learn what the people who are doing those things are, what they're for, and make sure that those are the ones you support and get the word out there.
Thanks, Jessica. All fantastic responses. I think those are all really great suggestions and tips for our audience members on how they can get involved. I know we also got one short other question in the queue about where can people go to learn more. And I just want to put out there, go to Just Zero's website, go to Gaia's website, go to NRDC's website, go to your state government website. There's so many organizations and places out there where you can go on their website, follow them on social media, and learn more. No-burn.org, as Jessica just put in the chat, is Gaia's website, just for a clarification.
Not the most intuitive, so just
yeah. So great clarification. And with that, that's all the time that we have. Thank you all, our audience, for joining us today. I hope you learned something. I hope you're able to walk away from this and get involved. To our speakers, thank you all so much for being here. It was a pleasure. It was incredibly educational, and we greatly appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thanks.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, everyone.